Okay, so I'm going to bring the tone down somewhat from the very lofty topics of the morning so far and talk about the humble area of consular what? There was a blank in the program there. In 2009, a 30-something Melbourne mother of four travelled to Phuket for a holiday. Her holiday was one of more than 500,000 trips taken by Australians to Thailand every year. In a drunken prank at a bar ominously called the Aussie Bar, the woman's friends took a 1.6-metre long bar mat and stuffed it in her handbag. After altercations with the police and the bar owner, the woman found herself in a Thai jail, charged with theft, becoming one of 1,019 Australians arrested overseas that year. She demanded the Australian government help secure her release. Her husband criticised the government's response as being nowhere near good enough. Just after her release, former Foreign Minister Alexander Downer fired off a sharply worded column in the Adelaide Advertiser. "It's about time," Downer thundered, "that great nanny in Canberra, the federal government, turned around and told people that they are responsible for their own decisions." Well, this was unfortunately not a point that he made, apologies Georgina, during his long tenure as Foreign Minister. In 2013, I wrote a policy brief for the Institute because I was struck by the number of these sorts of consular cases, given the high prominence in the media, producing what I felt were disproportionate responses from government, particularly in terms of the level of involvement of senior politicians. I was aware of the rapid growth in overseas travel, the stresses produced by the strings of crises such as those in 2011, which included the Arab Spring, earthquakes in New Zealand, the tsunami in Japan, which required massive and disruptive diversions of resources within the Department of Foreign Affairs in order to deal adequately with the large numbers of Australian travellers caught overseas in these crises. In my paper, I proposed a number of measures to address what I called Australia's consular conundrum. The one that received the most attention was the idea of a consular levy, a small fee, very small, levied on the cost of a passport or an airline ticket. The UK already imposes one, Canada charges one, and the Netherlands has a €2.50 fee charged by travel agents on every trip, which goes into a so-called calamity fund. Needless to say, however, the consular levy idea here fell like a brick balloon. Some were concerned that it would raise expectations even further by leading travellers to think that they had paid for their consular assistance. I did make a number of other less controversial recommendations which got no attention whatsoever. In 2015, the paper for this conference really revisits that 2013 paper and goes into a bit more detail on some of the aspects which are becoming more relevant to today's work. First, I look at the numbers to see whether the trends have shifted, and they have not. Overseas travel by Australians continues to grow strongly. That's the blue lines, the blue columns. The trend line has actually accelerated in the last decade. The blue columns show the acceleration in this period compared with that in the late 80s. Over the same period, the number of Australia-based Department of Foreign Affairs staff posted overseas fell dramatically in the 90s and the 2000s, but has started building very slowly now after reaching its low point in 2004. This is a pretty damning statistic. Overall, the Department of Foreign Affairs staffing between 1996 and 2013, before the AusAid integration, remained virtually unchanged, but the government sector as a whole grew by 60%. Since the integration of AusAid, approximately 600 to 650 positions have been removed from the combined entity. For those of you who are familiar with the line of Institute work on what we call Australia's diplomatic deficit since 2009, my argument in the consular policy area in relation to DFAT and diplomacy more generally has been that the overseas network that DFAT operates has been stretched too thinly. When crises strike, and there are many of them, the pressures on DFAT's resources flow through to its consular operations. The net result is that when crises strike, DFAT is forced to manage them by robbing Peter to pay Paul. They're not my words, they're the words of Dennis Richardson in estimates in 2011. Staff are flown in from around the region to address the crisis. A large amount of resources in Canberra are consumed in running the crisis operations, and some of the other day-to-day work of the department is relegated to secondary priority. This set of priorities reflects to some extent the priorities Australians put on consular assistance. When asked in our 2011 annual poll to rank 12 foreign policy goals for government, ranging from protecting Australian jobs to seeking a Security Council seat, Australians ranked protecting Australian citizens abroad a very high fourth position equal with strengthening the Australian economy and combating terrorism, surprisingly, and higher than controlling illegal immigration. Yes, that's right. This priority accorded to the consular function is relatively recent, at least with respect to government. The consular service used to be regarded as a Cinderella service, involving service tasks of low priority and low prestige. But the consular function is the public face of any foreign ministry, and it's a reputational risk for the ministry. Mismanagement of consular incidents can end political careers. Not perhaps here, but it did happen in Sweden when heads rolled following its poor response to the Asian tsunami. There are also some demographic trends which are increasing the pressures on the consular service. There's been growth across all age groups, but the strongest growth is in age groups which can present the most difficult challenges for consular work. And this chart shows you where those pressure points are. This is growth, by the way, not absolute numbers. So you can see there most of the groups of travellers have grown by almost 100%, they've doubled. But older Australians are travelling even more. Travel for 65 to 74-year-olds has tripled in 10 years. Travel for 0 to 9-year-olds has more than doubled. These age groups present consular challenges. Elderly travellers are more likely to fall ill, need assistance, or even die abroad. There are more than 1,000 deaths and hospitalisations of Australians overseas every year. Children are a high-risk category because they're vulnerable in family disputes. Cases are also becoming more complex. There are more child abductions, custody disputes, forced marriages. There are more expatriate Australians and dual citizens. When crises strike, it's harder for those dual citizens or expatriates who are resident in another country to uproot and leave. This adds another layer of complexity for consular work. Patterns of travel are also changing. The mix of destinations is very different now from what it was a couple of decades ago. In the 90s, New Zealand, the US and the UK were the most popular destinations. Today, Indonesia is the second most popular, Thailand is the fifth. The fastest growing destinations in the top 10 include places like Cambodia, India, Thailand, Nepal and Pakistan, would you believe? Consular work in these places can be extremely challenging because of fewer or less sophisticated local services, instability or security risks. Demands on the service are also changing. Some of those younger travellers are also less experienced travellers, unsurprisingly. They're more likely to go on adventure trips, extreme sports, engaging risky behaviour, get arrested, get into financial difficulty. They're also more likely, according to the department, to make unreasonable consular requests. There are some notorious examples of this, and these go to the rising expectations Australians have had of the sort of consular assistance they should receive. This is not a particularly Australian phenomenon. Back in 2013, I released a list of some of the silliest requests DFAT had received over the past few years. They included a guy ringing DFAT to ask for help locating his friend overseas because he hadn't heard from him for 3 years and he wanted to get the friend's motorbike out of his garage. There have been requests to find the nearest pub televising the state of origin, fair enough, or asking for help to pay a prostitute's bill, maybe not so. The Foreign Office has its own lists: pest control advice for ants in a holiday rental, help replacing false teeth, complaints from people unhappy about their plastic surgery. There are lots of those. One might think these silly cases don't consume any time, but of course they do, simply in the burden of having to deal with them and redirect them. They're not the real problem, though, in my humble opinion. The real problem is when politicians become involved in high-profile cases, which simply ups the expectations for the next person caught in trouble. I've tried to illustrate this with my vicious cycle flowchart. The Bali boy case is a prime example. A 14-year-old was arrested in Bali for a dope deal on the street. Naturally, the case got a lot of press. But the Prime Minister personally intervened and spoke with the boy on the phone. This sort of high-level political involvement is not sustainable. Which leads me to the latest developments in Australia's consular diplomacy, if you could call it that, which are good ones. Firstly, we have a new government and a new minister. Perhaps as a result of a strong incoming government brief from DFAT, the Foreign Minister commenced a public consultation on a new consular strategy for 2014 to 16. This is a first for the department, although there are lots of examples elsewhere in the world. The new strategy was launched late last year. Far from restating the usual mantra of, you must read travel advisories and get travel insurance, the strategy signals a couple of important shifts. Firstly, the government rejected the suggestion made in a couple of the submissions to enshrine the right of consular assistance in law. It is not in law in Australia. The strategy makes it clear that the government regards consular assistance as a privilege and not an entitlement. Secondly, the strategy incorporates a revised consular charter, which is simpler and clearer It emphasises the need for self-reliance, personal responsibility, and the need for self-help when travelling and living overseas. And thirdly, and this is really new, the strategy states that it will prioritise those in greatest need, vulnerable travellers and most serious cases, and may even limit assistance in cases of deliberate illegal behaviour or repeated acts of recklessness or negligence. And I believe they had the Colin Russell case in mind when they did that. In the last year, while there have been fewer natural disasters, Australia has had more than its share of consular crises. There were the executions of Andrew Chan and Myuran Sukumaran in Bali. They required an enormous amount of work and lobbying from the Department and the Foreign Minister. There is the ongoing and very diabolically thorny issue of Australian foreign fighters and their families in Iraq and Syria, which are hugely testing both in principle and in practice for consular officials and the government. And just over a year ago, there was the MH17 Downing, which required a massive diplomatic effort, drawing resources from around the region, and we actually had to open an embassy because we didn't have one in Kiev. On that note, the extent of Australia's diplomatic network has been a continuing problem, I think, for the conduct of our diplomacy generally and for delivering consular services specifically. Our network is too thinly spread. Some of our largest tourist destinations, such as Thailand, have, until now, only one post. Some of our largest trading partners, such as South Korea, have only one post. There are 193 member nations in the United Nations, and we have posts in only 80 of them. By contrast, there are 120 countries with diplomatic representation here in Canberra. So there's an imbalance and a lack of reciprocity, but that's not actually the damaging problem. More damaging is that the consequence of having the network like this is that it is stretched too thinly. If an Australian gets into difficulty in South America, Eastern Europe or Africa, for example, the nearest Australian mission could be several countries away. This government has made some progress. In this year's budget, 5 new missions, 4 new locations were announced, including a much-needed one in Phuket. The others were in Makassar, Buka, Ulaanbaatar, Doha. But this still leaves a significant shortfall compared with the OECD or G20 average network size, which in 2011 was around 130, and we're in the process of updating it now. In the meantime, the government's new consular strategy also indicated an intention to expand its cooperation internationally to extend the reach of the diplomatic network. We already have a consular sharing arrangement with Canada, which provides Australians with assistance in 17 locations, mostly in Africa, and we represent Canada in 22. And the idea seems to be to extend and expand this model. In 2014, we announced that we would share premises with the UK and Baghdad. That'll generate considerable savings. International cooperation also means sharing best practices and even cooperating in some consular areas such as crises, including evacuations. Finally, I should mention the Vienna Convention, which is the consular elephant in the room. I have had the great pleasure of reading the convention from cover to cover many times, and there is no doubt that it's antiquated and ill-adapted to contemporary circumstances. That said, there is little appetite internationally to revisit it for fear of losing even those minimum standards that are there. This means there is a greater role for and need for bilateral cooperation to resolve issues such as the minimum standards for treatment of prisoners in countries which are not signatories to human rights treaties, for the treatment of dual citizens, which is a very important issue, particularly in countries which don't recognise dual citizenship. So just to recap, the challenges for the consular service which have developed over the last few decades are not going to go away. Rising numbers of travellers, increasing numbers of dual citizens, changing destination types, more complex cases, more adventure travel, more risky destinations, changing demographics, high expectations of government assistance. Some of the solutions to these challenges have been identified by government, and it's taking some small steps to address them. More posts, stronger messaging, action to encourage personal responsibility and increased international cooperation. While it's too early to tell, there are a couple of examples from the last few months which might indicate a shift is already taking place. The Foreign Minister is becoming quite firm and I think quite detached in her communications about some of the more minor consular cases. I'm not talking about the serious ones. The example of the young woman deported from Abu Dhabi for the undisclosed content of a Facebook post was an example. The Minister barely commented on it, except to confirm the likely deportation. The second example was the recent airport closures in Bali due to the volcanic ash. From all the media coverages of the disruptions, I didn't read or see one media piece seeking government intervention or blaming the government for its lack of assistance. And that's a big contrast with how the Australian public reacted in 2010 with the Bangkok airport closures. So while the problems facing the consular service are far from solved, I think there have been some good steps in the right direction, hence the title of my article, Travelling Responsibly, Further to Go. Thank you.